Let me tell you about silence, not the comfortable kind. Not the silence of a library on a Sunday afternoon, or the hush that falls over a stadium the moment before a hero lands. Not that silence. The silence I mean is the kind that lives inside a person. The kind that grows in the space where confidence should be. Where hope should be. Where the simple, unshakable knowledge that you belong here, you matter, you are wanted should be. That silence is a living thing. It breathes. It feeds. And for 15 years, Izuku Midoriya had been feeding it without knowing. Every cruel word a meal, every dismissive glance a feast, every door closed quietly in his face a banquet it devoured whole. By the time he was 14 years old, that silence had grown so vast, so consuming, that sometimes he wasn't certain there was anything left of him at all. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. First, you need to understand who he was. Really was. Not the hollow-eyed boy the world had made him into. But the boy underneath that. The one who existed before the erosion. The one who, if you looked closely enough, if you were patient and perceptive and willing to see, was still there. Barely. Like an ember in a rainstorm, guttering and small and furiously, desperately alive. His name was Izuku Midoriya, and he had loved heroes for as long as he could remember. This is not a small thing. Understand that. In a world restructured around the existence of quirks, the superhuman abilities that had emerged in the human population over a century ago and transformed society, from its foundation up, loving heroes was as common as breathing. Every child had a favorite. Every school had a hero studies track. Action figures, trading cards, themed lunchboxes, themed everything. Heroes were the mythology of the modern age, the gods walking among mortals, the proof that the impossible was only impossible until someone made it happen. Children loved heroes the way they loved the idea of magic. Enthusiastically. Casually. The way you love something that is part of the landscape, part of the furniture of your world. Izuku loved heroes the way the desperate love rescue. He had notebooks. 37 of them by last count, weathered spiral-bound stacked beneath his bed and on his desk and crammed into his school bag, every page dense with his cramped, careful handwriting, analysis, observation, tactical breakdowns of publicly documented hero battles, hypotheses about quirk combinations and structural weaknesses and creative applications of abilities their users had never considered. Each notebook was a love letter to a dream. Each page was a prayer sent upward to a heaven he was increasingly certain had stopped listening. He had filled notebook number 1 at age 4, the same year the doctor had pressed cool fingers against the joint of his toe, the joint that determined quirk potential, 1 joint for those without, 2 for those with, and confirmed, in a voice carefully calibrated to neutrality, what the X-ray already showed, 1 joint, quirkless. He could still see his mother's face. The way she tried to hold the expression steady and couldn't quite manage it. The way her chin wobbled. And then she was on her knees in front of him and her arms were around him, and she was saying, over and over, "I'm sorry, Izuku. I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry." He had patted her back. 4 years old, and he had patted her back and told her it was okay. It was not okay, but he had become very practiced at believing it was. The morning of October 14th began the same way most of Izuku's mornings began, with the specific, soul-grinding ritual of pretending he was all right. He woke at 6:15. Made his bed with the mechanical precision of someone who had learned that small acts of order were the only reliable bulwark against chaos. Dressed in his school uniform, navy blazer, white shirt, the familiar weight of the fabric that had never quite felt like it belonged on him, like a costume for a role he kept understudy for. Ate breakfast at the kitchen table while his mother moved around the apartment with careful cheerfulness, talking about the weather, about a hero sighting downtown, about whether he wanted rice or toast. "Rice is fine, Mom," he said. "You sure? You look tired, Izuku." "I slept fine." He hadn't slept fine. He'd been up until 2 in the morning filling notebook 37 with a detailed analysis of Ground Zero's combat technique, Katsuki Bakugo's combat technique, his childhood tormentor's combat technique. Because even now, even after everything, Izuku Midoriya could not stop his brain from noticing and cataloging and understanding things, even things that hurt him to look at. Especially those things. His brain was the one thing no one had ever been able to take from him. They had certainly tried. He ate his rice. He watched the morning hero news. All Might had stopped a train derailment in Osaka. The footage was spectacular, naturally, that enormous golden figure laughing in the face of disaster, effortlessly rerouting catastrophe through sheer unyielding will, and Izuku felt the familiar complicated ache of it. Admiration so profound it was almost grief, the knowledge that this was what he wanted more than air, pressed against the knowledge of what he was, quirkless. Deku. He packed his school bag, kissed his mother's cheek, stepped out into the October morning. He made it 3 blocks before he adjusted his mental calculations about how the day would go. School, for Izuku Midoriya, had long ceased to be a place of learning. It was a gauntlet. A daily exercise in survival management. Navigate the hallway. Don't make eye contact with Bakugo's group. Sit in the back left corner. Answer questions only when directly called on. Volunteer nothing, because volunteering was visibility, and visibility was danger. Take notes. Fill notebooks. Hold the silence inside you steady and controlled, because if it spills over, if you let it show, the vultures will circle. He had it down to a science. 15 years of iteration. A finely honed personal algorithm for invisibility. Today, the algorithm failed in homeroom, at exactly 8:47 in the morning. He knew the moment it began. The particular quality of the murmur that moved through the class when Sensei Kanata brought up career paths. The way heads turned, not to Izuku, but toward Bakugo, and then, with that specific sideways cruelty of teenagers, toward Izuku. So Sensei said, shuffling papers with the magnificent disinterest of a man counting down to retirement, you'll all be submitting your career path intentions by the end of the month. I assume most of you are looking at the hero track, given your quirk profiles. A ripple of enthusiasm through the classroom. Excited murmurs. Bakugo's chin lifted with the absolute certainty of someone who had never once doubted his own destiny. And then, because the universe is occasionally, specifically, personally cruel, Sensei's eyes found Izuku Midoriya. You'll be submitting for general studies, I assume? Given your... A delicate pause. An infinitesimal hesitation. The kind that says everything it doesn't say. Situation. The classroom went quiet. Not the good kind of quiet. Izuku felt 30 pairs of eyes. He felt the weight of them like a physical thing, like stones. He felt his face doing the thing it did, the careful, neutral, practiced expression that he'd been assembling for years. The mask that said, this doesn't touch me, I am fine. Nothing here reaches the real parts of me. Yes, Sensei, he said. Quietly. Evenly. From the front of the classroom, Bakugo let out a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. It was something worse. Something knowing and contemptuous and utterly casual. The way you laugh at something that isn't worth the full effort of ridicule. A half laugh. A dismissal. General studies, Bakugo muttered, just loud enough. Right where you belong, Deku. More laughter. Not all of them. Maybe half. But half was enough. Half had always been enough. Izuku wrote the date in the margin of his notebook. Pressed his pen down a little harder than necessary. Kept his face neutral. Fine, said the practiced part of him. You're fine. You're fine. You're, oh Deku. And here was the thing about Bakugo. The thing that made him uniquely, specifically, exhaustingly terrible. He didn't do it out of genuine hatred. That would have been cleaner. Easier to categorize. Hatred has a logic to it. A comprehensibility. No, Bakugo did it the way someone kicks a rock in their path. Not malice. Barely awareness. Simple, reflexive dismissal, born from 15 years of the world confirming that Izuku Midoriya was beneath his notice, and therefore below the basic consideration one extended to people. That was the worst part. That Bakugo barely noticed him enough to hate him. He noticed enough to mock. There was a distinction. You're not still thinking about the hero track, are you? It was almost curious. The voice of someone genuinely puzzled by an absurdity. I heard you talking to Yamamoto-sensei last semester. About Yue. Silence. Absolute silence. Every head in the room was turned now. Izuku did not look up from his notebook. I don't know what you're talking about. You do, though. Bakugo stood. He always stood. He couldn't ever contempt sitting down. The gesture required full production. He was already holding small explosions in his palm, the casual crackle of them, pop pop pop, like a man drumming fingers on a desk. Yue. You actually think you're going to get into Yue? You, Deku. You. The laughter was fuller now. More confident. Fed by its own momentum. Bakugo, someone began. No, seriously. Bakugo dropped back into his seat with the loose-limbed confidence of someone who owned every room he'd ever walked into. I just want to understand the thought process. I want to know what's happening in your head that makes you think. And here, the cruelest thing, the words delivered so carelessly, so offhandedly, that someone who can't even throw a punch should be dreaming about being a hero. I genuinely want to know. It's fascinating, like biologically. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of everything that wouldn't be said. Full of 30 people privately calculating whether they agreed, whether they felt bad, whether they would intervene, and arriving, one by one, at the comfortable conclusion that this wasn't their problem. Izuku's pen had stopped moving. His hand was very still on the page. Somewhere in the practiced architecture of his composure, something trembled. A hairline crack. Too small to see from the outside. Invisible, even to him, for just a moment, before the algorithm kicked in, before the 15 years of practice reasserted themselves, before the mask settled back into place. He looked up. You're right, he said, and the words came out so quietly, so steadily, that several people leaned forward to hear them. I'll think about it. He wrote the next line in his notebook. The class moved on. Bakugo watched him for another 3 seconds with that puzzled expression, like a predator encountering prey that hadn't run, and then, because Izuku had given him nothing to push against, turned away. Izuku wrote. The letters were slightly uneven. Only he could tell. After school, because the universe is committed to its themes, he was cornered by the river. It was a familiar spot, a path between the school and the residential streets, lined with high concrete walls and a chain-link fence on one side, the brown shimmer of the river on the other. No witnesses. No exit routes that didn't require walking through the crowd. A location selected not with conscious planning but with the instinctive territorial mapping of boys who have done this before. There were 3 of them. Bakugo and 2 others, Morio and Fukushima, who had the particular energy of people who enjoyed watching cruelty more than committing it but were happy to provide an audience. Bakugo didn't even look menacing about it. That was the thing. He looked bored, arms crossed, the October wind pulling at his ash-blonde hair, that crease between his brows that meant he was thinking about something that annoyed him. Izuku's notebook was in his hand. Number 37. What is this? Not a question. A statement delivered in the tone of someone presenting evidence at a trial they're already winning. Izuku kept very still. My notes. Your analysis. Bakugo flipped it open with 2 fingers, like the pages might be contaminated. Scanned a line. His expression shifted, not to anger, but to something almost like incredulity. You wrote 6 pages about my quirk. About my combat applications. You've broken down my explosion radius, my detonation acceleration, the sweat production rate. He looked up. What is wrong with you? I take notes on everyone, Izuku said carefully. It's not, it's obsessive. The word landed flat and certain. And it's pathetic. You know that, right? A quirkless nobody writing analysis papers about people who are actually going to be something. Like you think understanding it gets you any closer to having it. Izuku said nothing. Bakugo stepped closer. 1 step. The crackle of micro-explosions in his palm. Pop pop. Like punctuation. I'm going to give you some advice, Deku, because we used to be, because I'm feeling generous. The pause where he nearly said friends was not acknowledged by either of them. Give up the hero dream. Give up UA. Take the general studies track, get a regular job, live a regular life. Don't embarrass yourself trying to reach for something that will never, ever be for you. And if you really want to be a hero so bad, he plucked the notebook from Izuku's hands, held it over the railing, above the slow brown water of the river. Maybe take a swan dive off the roof and hope you get a quirk in your next life. He dropped it. The notebook hit the water and sank. 37 volumes of love and hope and careful, furious intelligence, gone in 3 seconds. Bakugo and his followers walked away without looking back. Izuku stood at the railing for a long time. The river moved below him, sluggish and indifferent, swallowing his notebook the way it swallowed everything, with complete, magnificent lack of concern. The October sun was dropping toward the concrete horizon of the city, painting the clouds in colors that would have been beautiful if Izuku were in a condition to notice beauty. He was not. He was conducting a very quiet internal audit. "You're fine," said the practiced part of him. "Are you?" said something else. Something further down. Something that had been waiting for a long time to ask that question and had finally, on this particular afternoon, run out of patience. "Are you actually fine?" He fished the notebook from the water. It was sodden, most of the pages blurred past reading. Months of work. Gone. He held it in both hands and looked at it, and thought, very clearly and very calmly, in the way that thoughts come when emotion has outpaced itself and arrived at a strange, clear place on the other side. "I am so tired." Not tired the way you're tired after a long day. Not physically, not the tiredness that sleep cures. Tired. The bone-deep, cellular exhaustion of someone who has been carrying something too heavy for too long and has finally, on a Tuesday in October by a river that doesn't care, looked at the weight and thought, "I cannot do this anymore." He walked home. Slowly. He walked the way people walk when they're not sure where they're going, and home is just the direction they happen to be drifting. He passed familiar streets without seeing them. He passed the billboard with the All Might advertisement, the hero's enormous grin, the catchphrase "Go Beyond, Plus Ultra," beaming down from a full-color Triumph, and didn't look up. He ate dinner. Quietly. His mother asked him twice if he was okay. He said yes twice, and the lies came out so smoothly that he almost believed them himself. He went to his room. He sat on his bed. He looked at the wall of hero merchandise. The posters, the figures, the reminders of 15 years of wanting something so desperately that it had become indistinguishable from breathing, and for the first time in his life, he felt nothing when he looked at them. Not love. Not longing. Not even the sad residue of hope. Nothing. And somehow, that was the thing that broke him. Not the notebook in the river. Not Bakugo's words, "Take a swan dive, hope you get a quirk in your next life." Not the classroom laughter. Not the 15 years of accumulated small violences that the world considered unremarkable because they left no visible marks. Not any one thing. The nothing broke him. The realization that they had taken something from him that he hadn't even noticed leaving. Hadn't felt it go. Had been so busy surviving each individual day that he missed the moment when the fire went out. When the boy who had filled notebook after notebook with desperate, furious love for a dream had become someone sitting on a bed, looking at that dream's relics, and feeling nothing. He lay back on his bed, stared at the ceiling, and for the first time, allowed himself to really, truly, fully feel the weight of what his life was, what it had always been, what it would continue to be, if nothing changed. Quirkless. Deku. The boy told he couldn't. The boy who kept his notebooks and his analysis and his encyclopedic knowledge of hero techniques and never, ever got to use any of it for anything except surviving the next day. The boy who had loved so completely and been given so little in return. The boy who had said I'm fine so many times it had become a kind of prayer to a god of smallness, a deity of survival, a faith built entirely on endurance without reward. He closed his eyes. I'm so tired, he thought again. The clearest thought he'd had in years. I'm so tired of being nothing. He went to school the next morning because momentum is a powerful thing, and 15 years of routine is hard to break even when everything inside you is very, very quiet. He sat through 3 classes. He ate lunch alone, in the corner of the roof-access stairwell where he always ate when the cafeteria felt like too much, which was most days. He had a new notebook. Blank. He'd bought it that morning from the convenience store on autopilot. The way you reach for the familiar when everything else is uncertain. He sat with it in his lap and didn't open it. He thought about All Might's advertisement. Go Beyond. Plus Ultra. He thought about the way his mother had looked when the doctor confirmed it, all those years ago. One joint. I'm sorry. He thought about Bakugo dropping his notebook over the railing with the casual ease of someone discarding a receipt. He thought, what if he's right? Not about the swan dive, but about the rest. They give up, it's not for you. Stop embarrassing yourself reaching for something that will never be yours. What if that was simply the truth? What if all the notebooks in the world, all the analysis, all the understanding. What if none of it meant anything without the single fundamental thing he would never have? A quirk. The ability to be something in this world. To matter in the way that the world had decided people should matter. He opened the notebook to the first page. He wrote very slowly, "What am I without this?" Stared at it. And then, with a handwriting that was barely his own, underneath, "Is there anything left?" The roof. He wasn't sure, afterward, how he got there. Or at what point the stairwell had become the stairwell with the door at the top, the door that opened onto the flat gray expanse of the school rooftop with its low concrete railing and its view of the city spread out below. He wasn't sure at what point thinking had become walking. He stood at the railing. The wind was colder up here. It pulled at his blazer with absent, indifferent fingers. Below, the city went about its business with magnificent disinterest. People moving like electrons, cars tracing predictable routes. Somewhere in the distance a hero agency's alert signal cycling through its test tones, barely audible. He looked down at his hands on the railing. Still the same hands. Ink-stained fingers. Calluses from holding a pen for too many hours. The small scar on his left palm from the time he'd grabbed a chain-link fence in a panic when he was 9 and Bakugo had sent an explosion too close. Still his hands. Still him. Am I still me? He wondered. Was there ever a me that was worth keeping? The silence inside him answered. He didn't jump. Understand that. It matters. He didn't jump. He stood at that railing with the wind in his hair and the city below and 15 years of hurt pressing against the inside of his chest. And he did not jump. Because underneath everything, underneath the exhaustion and the nothing and the terrible quiet where his hope used to be, there was still something. Something he didn't have a name for. Something too stubborn and too fundamental to the architecture of who he was. Something that said, not yet. Not like this. But it was small. It was very, very small. And the distance between not yet and maybe had never felt shorter. He gripped the railing harder. Tell me something, he thought, to no one. To the sky. To the city. To whatever might be listening. Tell me something that makes this worth it. Tell me one reason. One. The wind moved. The city did not answer. And then his phone buzzed in his pocket, and he pulled it out automatically, the reflex of years, and saw a news notification. All Might defeats villain force in Tokyo. Watch the footage. He pressed play before he could stop himself. All Might. That enormous, ridiculous, incandescent figure. That smile. God, that smile, like sunlight given human form, laughing in the face of a villain who had just thrown a building at him. And All Might's voice, even through tinny phone speakers, carrying the absolute certainty of someone who had never once believed in the word impossible. Because I am here. Izuku stared at the screen, his grip on the railing loosened. And then, something happened that had no rational explanation. Something that he would spend a very long time trying to articulate, and never quite manage. He felt watched. Not the way you feel watched when someone is looking at you. Not the prickling discomfort of surveillance, or the nervous awareness of being observed. Something different. Something that came from below, not below the roof, not below the city, but below everything. From underneath the world itself, from somewhere so deep and so dark and so vast that the word below barely covered it. Something was looking at him, something that had no eyes but nonetheless saw. He turned around. The roof was empty. He turned back to the railing. The feeling intensified. Focused. Like a lens bringing light to a single point. Like something incomprehensibly huge compressing itself to look at one small, ink-stained, exhausted boy on a school rooftop in a city that didn't know he existed. And then, not a voice. Not out loud. Not sound at all. More like a vibration in the architecture of his thoughts, a resonance, a frequency that bypassed his ears entirely and arrived directly in the center of his consciousness. Interesting. He went very still. A soul this bright, said the not voice. Wandering so close to the edge of my domain. Izuku's heartbeat was very loud. Who, he started. Not yet, the resonance said. And it was not unkind. That was the thing that would stay with him, later, in the time after, in the other place, in the before everything changed. It was not unkind. It was curious. Warm even, in the way that deep places are sometimes warm. The warmth of things that have been sealed away for so long they've generated their own heat. Not yet, little ember. Hold on a moment longer. I want to take a closer look at you. The wind dropped. The city sound muffled, as though someone had placed a hand over the world's mouth. And the October afternoon light dimmed at the edges. Not darkness, not exactly, more like the light was being considered, held up and examined and found insufficient. And Izuku Midoriya stood at the railing of his school's rooftop and felt something vast and ancient and extraordinarily attentive turning its full focus toward him. He held on. He didn't know why, but he held on. He walked home in a state that wasn't quite shock and wasn't quite wonder and wasn't quite fear, but had elements of all three mixed in proportions he couldn't calculate. The wind had come back. The light had normalized. The city was exactly as it always was. The feeling of being watched was gone, but the memory of it wasn't. He sat through dinner again. Answered his mother's questions. Washed the dishes. Went to his room. Sat on his bed. Opened the new notebook. Wrote, with steadier handwriting than he'd managed in months, something happened today. I don't know what it was. I don't know what it means. But I think, he stopped, started again. I think something noticed me. He sat with that sentence for a long time. Outside, the city settled into its nighttime registers. Somewhere in the distance, a hero response siren. The familiar rhythm of the world going about its business. He lay back. Closed his eyes. And for the first time in he couldn't remember how long, he fell asleep before he could lie awake cataloging the day's failures. He dreamed of darkness, not frightening darkness. Not the darkness of nothing, of absence, of the terrible quiet he'd been living in, inhabited darkness. Breathing darkness. Dark the way old libraries are dark, full, purposeful, dense with things waiting to be found. And in the dream, at a distance he couldn't quite resolve, something enormous and luminous and older than the concept of old turned toward him with an attention that should have been crushing and instead felt impossibly like being seen, like being found. He slept. The next morning, he found the notebook on his desk. Number 37. Dry. Intact. Every page pristine and clear, not a smear, not a water stain, not a single blurred character. Sitting on his desk exactly where he kept his notebooks, as though it had never been dropped into a river by a boy who had dismissed him with a laugh. Izuku stood in his doorway for a very long time. He looked at the notebook. He looked at his hands. He thought about the roof. The dimming light. The resonance that hadn't been a voice but was more than silence. Not yet, little Ember. He picked up the notebook. Opened it. The writing was all there, every page, every analysis, every careful diagram of hero techniques and quirk applications, and a furious, loving documentation of a boy who could not stop understanding things even when understanding them was the only thing standing between him and the abyss. He sat down at his desk. He picked up a pen. He turned to the last written page and kept going. He went to school. He sat through homeroom. He sat through first period. He sat through second period, and something in him was different. Something quiet and watchful and new, like a compass needle that has found north for the first time and keeps returning to it reflexively, checking, making sure. At lunch, instead of the stairwell, he went to the roof. He stood where he'd stood the day before. The same railing. The same city below. A clearer day. The October sky blue and sharp, the kind of blue that looks like an announcement. He waited. Nothing happened. Of course nothing happened. He was a rational person. He understood confirmation bias and sleep deprivation hallucination and the brain's tendency to pattern match under emotional duress. Yesterday had been an extreme day. He'd been exhausted. Overwhelmed. He had probably imagined. You didn't imagine it. He did not jump. He did grip the railing until his knuckles went white. The resonance was back. Lower this time. Closer. Like something that had been listening from a great distance had taken several deliberate steps toward him. I've been watching you, it said. Watching and thinking. I do a great deal of thinking. I've had considerable time. What are you? Izuku asked, out loud, in the voice of someone who has decided that if they're losing their mind they might as well commit to the process. Something old, the resonance said, with what might have been amusement. Something that recognizes rarity when it sees it. And you, Izuku Midoriya, are remarkable. I'm quirkless. Yes. The agreement came immediately, without hesitation or softening. That directness, The refusal to dress the fact in comfort was somehow more startling than reassurance would have been. Yes. You are. And in spite of that, because of that, perhaps, you are the most interesting soul I have encountered in a very, very long time. The wind moved through his hair. Why? He asked. And his voice cracked on the word, just slightly. Just enough. A pause. The quality of attention focused down to a single burning point. Because they broke everything they could break, the resonance said slowly, and you are still here. Still thinking. Still filling notebooks with understanding you cannot yet use. Still loving something so completely that the loss of it nearly unmade you, and you held on anyway. Another pause. Do you know how rare that is? That specific configuration, brilliance and endurance, and the capacity for love so profound it becomes its own kind of power? I have watched 10,000 years of human souls, boy. I have never found that combination without one piece diminishing the others. You burn evenly, it said. In the dark, you burn evenly. Do you understand how extraordinary that is? Izuku's eyes were wet. He hadn't noticed until now. I don't feel extraordinary, he said. No. Gentle. Absolute. You wouldn't. Extraordinary things rarely do, from the inside. They only feel like surviving. He stood there on the roof. Tears drying in the wind. The city spread below him, ordinary and vast and indifferent. And in his head, or not in his head, in something deeper than that, in some cavity of himself he hadn't known existed, something ancient and immense regarded him with an attention that felt, impossibly, like respect. What do you want? He asked finally. The same thing you do, the resonance said. To be no longer alone. To find someone worthy of something I've been carrying for a very long time. And I think, Izuku Midoriya, though I will not rush you, and I will not force anything, and I will wait as long as you need because I have been waiting long enough that a little longer is nothing, I think you might be exactly what I have been looking for. Silence. Below, the city moved. A hero response team crossed an intersection 5 blocks south. The October sky announced itself in shades of impossible blue. Izuku Midoriya held the railing and thought about a notebook that had come back dry from a river. Thought about 15 years of being told he was nothing. Thought about the small, stubborn, infuriating thing inside him that had refused, kept refusing, even yesterday, even at the worst of it, to fully believe them. Not yet. Maybe the voice in the resonance. Maybe himself. Maybe the same thing. He looked out at the city. I need to think, he said. Of course, said the ancient thing, with patience that felt like it had been measured in centuries. I'll be here. The light was normal. The wind was normal. The roof was empty and ordinary in every observable way. But as Izuku turned to go back inside, notebook under his arm, something caught at the edge of his vision. Or maybe at the edge of something deeper than vision. A shimmer. A doorway-shaped darkness that existed for exactly half a second before the world reasserted itself, and swallowed it whole. And from somewhere immeasurably far away, and somehow directly behind his heartbeat, a voice like a bell made of deep water said one last thing. They were wrong about you. They were always wrong about you. And soon, Izuku Midoriya, soon, the world will know it. He went back to class. He sat in his corner seat. He opened his notebook. He wrote the date in the margin with steady, ink-stained fingers. Around him, the class proceeded with its ordinary architecture of noise and boredom, and casual social hierarchy. Bakugo cracked his knuckles at the front. Someone passed a note. A teacher drew on the whiteboard in blue marker. Everything was exactly the same, and Izuku Midoriya was not. He couldn't have explained it. Not yet. Not in terms anyone would have found satisfying or rational or real. But something had shifted in the landscape of him. Some tectonic movement, slow and massive, rearranging the geography of what he believed was possible. He thought about what the resonance had said. You burn evenly. He thought about 37 notebooks. He thought about the word worthy. He pressed his pen to the page and wrote, in the careful, deliberate handwriting of someone who means every word. I don't know what's happening. I don't know what I'm about to agree to, or what it will cost, or whether any of this is real in the way that things are supposed to be real. But I know this. I am tired of being nothing. And for the first time in 15 years, something in this world is looking at me like I am the opposite of nothing. I know what that feels like now. I'm not sure I can give it up. He closed the notebook. Outside the window, the October sky held its impossible blue. A hero's emergency signal traced a thin line of sound across the afternoon. In the hollow where the silence had lived, something new was beginning to grow. Small still. Barely there. But even, and burning. The boy who was told he couldn't had not yet been told what he was. That conversation was coming. And when it arrived, when the darkness opened and the crown descended and the ancient compact was sealed between the soul that refused to break and the power that had been waiting for exactly that quality of unbreakable, the world would not have a word for what he became. It would have to invent one. Death, it turns out, is not an ending. It is a door. And doors, by their very nature, imply something on the other side. Here is what Izuku Midoriya expected when the world finally stopped. When the noise and the cruelty and the 15-year weight of being Deku simply ceased. When the last thread of consciousness he'd been gripping with bloody, exhausted fingers finally, mercifully, gave, he expected nothing. The clean, democratic nothing that waits for everyone regardless of quirk, or status, or the number of joints in your toe. The nothing that doesn't care whether you were loved or dismissed, celebrated or forgotten, hero or quirkless boy standing too close to a railing on a Tuesday afternoon. He expected the silence inside him to finally, completely, become everything. He did not expect to fall. Not downward, that's the thing. Not the way objects fall, pulled toward earth by patient, reliable gravity. He fell inward. Through himself. Through the layers of who he'd been, the careful mask, the practiced neutrality, the 15 years of algorithm and endurance. Through all of it like a stone dropping through still water. Each layer parting and closing above him. Going deeper and deeper into the architecture of Izuku Midoriya until he reached something he hadn't known was there. A core. Something small and fierce and incandescent. Burning in the absolute dark like a coal at the center of the earth. Something that had been burning, he understood suddenly, always. Through every notebook dropped in a river, every classroom laugh, every practice lie of I'm fine. Through all of it, this thing had burned. Quietly. Steadily. Evenly. And then the falling stopped. There was no gradual transition. No mist, no tunnel, no soft light beckoning from a comfortable distance. One moment, falling inward through the dark. Next moment, standing. He looked down at his feet and found them on a floor made of something that wasn't quite stone and wasn't quite shadow, something in between, solid enough to hold him but dark enough to drink the light. Polished to a depth that suggested it had been there since before light had opinions about it. He looked at his hands. Still ink-stained. Still scarred at the left palm. He was wearing his school uniform, which felt absurd, which felt like a joke the universe was telling at his expense, and he had the wild and inappropriate urge to laugh. He did not laugh. He looked up. And here is where language becomes genuinely inadequate. Where the machinery of description creaks and groans under a weight it was never built to carry. So bear with me while I try. The throne room. Calling it that is both exactly right and catastrophically insufficient. It was vast in the way that geological time is vast. Not in distance you could measure but in duration you could feel. In the sense that this space had been here long enough to develop opinions about the civilizations that had risen and fallen in the world above it. The ceiling was not visible. The walls were visible only as a darkening at the edges of perception, as the suggestion of boundaries rather than the thing itself. Columns rose from the floor at intervals that seemed to follow a logic Izuku's brain kept sliding off of, each one carved from that same between stone and shadow material, each one bearing carvings that moved when he didn't look directly at them. Light existed here, but it owed no debt to any sun. It came from within things, from the floor, from the columns, from the air itself. A deep phosphorescent blue that made shadows fall in unexpected directions and cast everything in the quality of deep ocean depths. It was, objectively, one of the most beautiful things Izuku had ever seen. It was also the most terrifying, and at the far end of this impossible space, on a throne that seemed less built than accumulated, as if darkness had simply decided, over centuries, to pile itself into a seat-shaped configuration, something sat. Something that was not looking at him yet. Something that was waiting for him to compose himself first. Which, Izuku thought, pressing his fingernails into his palm to confirm sensation, was either extraordinary courtesy or extraordinary confidence. Possibly both. He took 3 breaths. Deliberate. The way he'd learned to breathe when Bakugo's explosions were close and panic was the thing that would get him hurt. Then he walked forward. Up close, Malakar was both more and less than his expectations had assembled. Less, because, and this was the surprise, the thing that lodged in Izuku's throat like an unexpected kindness, he was not monstrous. Izuku had braced for monstrousness, for the aesthetic vocabulary of villainy, the red eyes, the contemptuous sneer, the power displayed ostentatiously like a man waving expensive things to compensate for something. He'd seen enough villain attacks on the hero news to have a whole taxonomy of dark powers preferred presentations. Malakar was none of them. He was tall, unfolding from the throne as Izuku approached in a motion that suggested height was a courtesy he was extending to physics rather than a constraint he was operating under. He was composed of dark and light in alternating layers, like a figure seen through deep water, like the negative space between stars, and his face, if you could call it a face, if your eyes could settle on it long enough to read it, held an expression that Izuku's cataloging brain, before he could stop it, filed under ancient amusement. Long patience rewarded, genuine curiosity, the non-predatory kind. His eyes were the only thing that stayed still. Fixed. Focused. They were the color of the spaces between galaxies, and they were looking at Izuku the way nothing had ever looked at him before. Not through him. Not past him. Not at the inconvenient fact of him. At him. All of him. Every layer, every notebook, every practice mask and the exhausted face beneath it, and the burning coal beneath that. Seen, completely and without flinching, by something that had been watching for a very long time and had decided, deliberately, to look. Izuku Midoriya, said Malakar. His voice was the bell made of deep water. It was the resonance from the roof, fully embodied now, and it moved through the air of the throne room the way sound moves through stone, not carried by it, but part of it. You held on longer than I expected. Izuku stopped 6 feet from the throne. He thought about all the responses available to him. Where am I? He said. Malakar's expression did something at the edges, the suggestion of appreciation. Direct. Good. He descended the throne steps with a gait that made no sound. You are in the veil, the space between the world you know and the world that underlies it. Between the human and the ancient. Between what you were and, a pause, deliberate and weighted, what you might become. Am I dead? No. That's, Izuku blinked. That's surprising. You are between. Which is different. Malakar circled him slowly, not the circling of predation, nothing so crude, but the circling of someone examining something remarkable from multiple angles. Izuku had the disconcerting sensation of being a page of writing read by someone who understood every language simultaneously. Your body remains at the place you call school. Suspended. Time here moves differently. We have as long as we need, and the world above will feel perhaps a moment's pause. Izuku processed this with the systematic, involuntary efficiency of a brain that could not stop analyzing things even in apparent purgatory. So this is some kind of liminal space. A threshold state, metaphysically consistent with certain documented theories about. You're doing the notebook thing, Malakar said. Izuku stopped. The analysis. The categorizing. The immediate reframing of overwhelming experience into manageable data. Something that might have been warmth moved through the ancient voice. You've been doing it your entire life. Making the unbearable understandable because understanding is the only power you were ever permitted. A pause. You don't have to do that here. You're permitted other powers now. The silence that followed was different from the silence Izuku was used to. It wasn't empty. What are you? Izuku asked. Because he was Izuku Midoriya, and when the practiced composure slipped there was always a question underneath it, waiting. What do I call you? What exactly is all of this? Malakar regarded him for a long moment. Then he sat, not on the throne, but on the steps leading up to it, with the unhurried ease of someone who has stopped performing grandeur for anyone who isn't worth it. The gesture was so unexpectedly casual that Izuku's entire threat assessment recalibrated in an instant. Sit down, Izuku, Malakar said. I will tell you what I am. All of it. You deserve the truth without architecture around it. Izuku sat, cross-legged, on the floor of an impossible throne room in the space between life and death, school uniform and all. I am what your world's oldest stories were trying to describe, Malachar began, before language was sophisticated enough to get it right. The thing that existed before your civilization decided what existence meant. Before quirks. Before the concept of heroism and villainy was invented to give human beings a framework for the incomprehensible. I predate the framework. His galaxy space eyes moved across the throne room slowly, like a man surveying a home he has occupied for longer than nations last. I am the first and oldest of what your mythology calls demon lords, though demon is a human word born from fear, and lord is a human word born from hierarchy, and neither one quite fits. Think of me instead as a primordial sovereign, a being of dominion, the thing that authority was modeled on, in the deep time before authority had a name. Izuku absorbed this. His brain helpfully cross-referenced 6 different folkloric traditions, 2 documented quirk anomaly cases, and a theory from a paper he'd read at 13 about the deep origins of so-called mythological quirk types. "And what do you want with me?" he asked. Malachar was quiet for 3 full seconds. "An inheritor," he said at last. The word dropped into the throne room's phosphorescent air like a stone into that between stone and shadow floor. Completely, without splash, swallowed whole. "I have waited," Malachar continued, and now there was something in the ancient voice that Izuku, who had spent 15 years developing extraordinary sensitivity to the emotional textures of things people tried to hide, recognized with a start as genuine weariness, for a very long time. For a soul capable of carrying what I carry. Not merely the power. Power without the right vessel is simply destruction waiting for a target. But this, he gestured, and the gesture encompassed something Izuku couldn't see but felt. The burning coal at his center, the even flame, the 15 years of notebooks and endurance. This specific quality, brilliance that bends toward understanding rather than dominance. Strength that was forged in suffering and came out neither broken nor cruel. The capacity to love something so completely that even the loss of it doesn't extinguish you. Another pause. "I have watched 10,000 years of human souls, Izuku Midoriya. I have watched kingdoms rise and collapse. I have observed every iteration of human excellence and human catastrophe. And in 10,000 years, I have found your particular configuration once. In me," Izuku said. "In you." The silence breathed. "Why does that feel more frightening than comforting?" Izuku said. Malachar smiled. It was the first time he'd smiled, and it transformed his face the way dawn transforms a landscape, not adding something new, but revealing what was already there. "Because you're intelligent enough to understand the weight of being chosen," he said. "Any fool can be flattered. It takes genuine wisdom to be frightened by genuine distinction." The smile faded into something more considered. "Good. You should be a little frightened. It means you're thinking clearly. What are you offering?" Izuku asked. And here is the moment the story turns. Pay attention. Because what Malachar said next was not what Izuku expected, not what anyone in that position had ever expected, and its unexpectedness was the thing that made Izuku lean forward 1 millimeter, the thing that cracked the careful distance he'd been maintaining. "Not servitude," Malachar said. Flat. Immediate. Like a man refusing something distasteful that's been offered too many times. "I have no interest in a vessel. A puppet, something that carries my power without understanding it." His galaxy space eyes fixed on Izuku's with an intensity that pressed. "I am offering you a covenant. Between equals." Izuku stared. "You," he said carefully, "are a 10,000-year-old primordial sovereign of the demon world." "Yes. And you want to make a deal with a 14-year-old quirkless nobody from..." "Stop. Gentle. Absolute. Stop using their words for yourself. Their words, their categories, their frameworks for what constitutes worth. You are in my domain now, and in my domain, the only currency is soul. And your soul..." Malachar reached forward and did something that had no physical component Izuku could identify but felt like a hand pressing flat against his chest, against the center of him. Against the burning coal. "Your soul is worth more than anything I have encountered in 10 millennia. Don't call it nothing." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Izuku had ever heard. He was going to say something. He had words assembled, the careful, deflecting, "I'm fine" words, the practiced machinery of someone who has never known how to receive something that looked like respect without immediately dismantling it. He had all of that ready. What came out instead was, They told me every day. For 15 years. I don't know how to. You don't have to know how yet, Malakar said quietly. That's what the covenant is for. He explained it slowly. Fully. Without the architectural flourishes of someone trying to sell something, which was the thing that kept Izuku listening, that kept his analysis from screaming trap, trap. Misdirection, the fine print. Where is the fine print? Because Malakar spoke the way people speak when they don't need to deceive. With the unhurried specificity of truth. The covenant was this: Malakar's power, primordial, vast, ancient beyond calculation, needed a human anchor. Not because it was weak, but because humanity was the context in which it would now operate, the human world. The world of heroes and villains and quirks and the whole extraordinary contemporary mythology of it. Power without human understanding navigating the human world was a river without banks, destructive, undirected, ultimately wasted. Izuku was the banks. In return, everything. The full inheritance of a demon lord's dominion. Shadow, illusion, presence, authority. The ability to command the forces that had existed before heroism was invented to oppose them. And this was the part that made Izuku's analytical brain sit up very straight. Malakar himself. Not as a master. Not as a possessor. As a voice. A second soul. An advisor with 10,000 years of perspective available at the back of Izuku's mind for the rest of his life. You would stay, Izuku said slowly. In me. Permanently. Unless you asked me to leave. Which you cannot. The covenant is permanent. But my presence within it, the degree to which you consult me, the weight you give my counsel, that is always your choice. Always. I will not compel, control, or override. I am. And I want you to understand this precisely, the world's oldest and most experienced advisor. What you do with the advice is yours. Izuku was quiet for a long time. What does it cost? He asked. Because there was always a cost. He'd read enough hero analyses to know that power without cost was the first lie every villain ever bought. Your previous life, Malakar said simply. Not your memory. Not the people you love. Not the person you are. Never that. But the path you were on. The shape of the future you were heading toward. You will not be a hero in the traditional sense. You will not follow the prescribed architecture of license and commission and public approval. You will be something the world does not yet have a category for, and that, a measured pause. That will be uncomfortable for many people. Some of them people you care about. Izuku thought about All Might's advertisement. Go beyond. Plus ultra. The dream he'd carried for 15 years. I wanted to be a hero, he said quietly. You wanted to help people, Malakar replied, with gentle precision. You wanted to stand between the helpless and the harmful. You wanted your existence to matter in the way that goodness matters, not just strength, but goodness. You wanted to be someone who showed up. A pause. Tell me, does that require a license? The question sat in the phosphorescent air of the veil. Izuku thought about 37 notebooks. Thought about years of analysis that no teacher had ever asked to see. Thought about the moment on the roof when he had felt watched, truly seen, for the first time. Thought about the word worthy. No, he said slowly. I don't think it does. I want to ask you something, Izuku said. Of course. Yesterday. On the roof. You felt me. He framed it carefully, the analyst in him needing the mechanism. Felt that I was close to something. And you reached out. Why? Malakar was still for a moment. Because, he said, with the slow weight of a truth being retrieved from a very deep place, the world is full of people who have been ground down by it. Who have been told, systematically and cruelly, that they are not enough. And most of them either break, become the cruelty that broke them, or they diminish. They accept the judgment. They stop burning. His eyes moved to Izuku's face. And then there are the rare ones. The ones who are ground down and ground down and ground down, and don't stop. Don't become cruel, and don't diminish. Just endure, and burn, and fill notebooks full of love for a thing they can have, and get up every morning and put on the mask and do it again. A pause. When I feel one of those, when I feel that specific quality of unbroken thing in the middle of breaking, I pay attention. Izuku's throat was tight. And what I felt in you yesterday, Malachar continued quieter now, was a soul standing at the edge of its endurance. Not because you were weak, because you had been carrying something too heavy, alone, for too long, and you were finally, nearly, out of road. He leaned forward. Just slightly. Enough. I reached out because I did not want to watch something that rare go out. Because I have watched things go out before and it diminishes the world every time, and something moved through the ancient face. Something that looked, impossibly, like grief. I am tired of watching lights go out, Izuku. I am very, very tired of it. The silence between them held something new in it. Something that felt, carefully and tentatively, like the beginning of understanding. Okay, Izuku said. Malachar looked at him. I'll do it. Izuku met those galaxy space eyes with the directness of someone who has made a decision and found, to his surprise, that it doesn't feel like falling. It feels like landing, not because I want power. Not because I want revenge, or recognition, or to prove anything to anyone. He took a breath. Because that burning thing you keep describing? I can feel it. I couldn't, before, not clearly. But here I can. And I don't want it to go out either. A pause. I want to find out what it's for. Malachar regarded him for 3 seconds. Then he said, with the gravity of something ancient and absolute settling into place. Then let us begin. The covenant was not signed. It was not written. There was no scroll, no blood, no dramatic visual theater of supernatural contract. Because this, and understand this matters deeply, matters as much as anything in this story, was not a transaction. Not a soul sold or a price paid or a human being diminished in exchange for something he couldn't afford. It was a recognition. Malachar extended his hand. Palm up. And what rested in it wasn't an object, wasn't anything Izuku could name. It was more like a quality, like the visual representation of the 10,000 years of patience, and wisdom, and watching and waiting, compressed into something that could be offered between two beings in a space between worlds. Izuku looked at it, looked at Malachar, looked down at his own ink-stained, scarred, unimpressive, extraordinary hands. He placed his palm against Malachar's, and the world came apart, not violently. Don't picture violence. Picture instead the moment when a door that has been closed for your entire life, that you didn't know was a door, that you had been pressing your back against without knowing, that was the very shape of the wall you thought was just the wall, swings open. Picture that. The sudden space. The sudden air. The sudden understanding that you were never as small as the room you were kept in. The covenant moved through him like a tide coming in, not overwhelming him, not replacing him, but filling the spaces. Every hollow place the world had carved out with its cruelty, and its dismissal, and its 15 years of you're not enough, you can't, you're nothing, filled. Not with power first, with something older than power, with the certainty of being seen, and then the power. Oh, it came from the deep places, from the below everything, from the dimension of darkness that predated the human concept of darkness, and made it look like a sketch. It rose through the floor of the veil and through the between stone and shadow beneath his feet and through the soles of his shoes and up through him. And it was vast, incomprehensibly, staggeringly vast, and yet it fit. That was the impossible part. It fit the way the right answer fits a problem you've been circling for years. It fit the way understanding fits the mind that was built for it. It didn't feel like putting on armor. It felt like taking off weight he'd been carrying since birth. The shadows in the throne room moved. Not drifted. Moved, with purpose, with direction, with the deliberate responsiveness of something that recognized its sovereign. They gathered around Izuku's feet and curled upward, and he felt them the way you feel your own fingers. Extensions, tools, his. He looked at his hands, and shadow pooled in his palms like water finding its level, and he thought, experimentally, rise. And it rose. Columns of it, cathedral high, effortlessly, like breathing. He looked at the throne room. He felt Malachar, not outside him now, but inside, a second presence. A vast intelligence settled into the background of his consciousness with the patience of something that has waited long enough to know the value of taking up exactly the right amount of space. Not crowding, not absent. Present in the way a good library is present, available, full, quiet until consulted. Breathe, Malachar said, from inside the architecture of him now. You have time. The power will settle. Give it a moment. Izuku started. Overwhelming. Yes. It always is at first. Give it a moment, he breathed. The power breathed with him. The shadows settled, attentive and patient, around his feet like a tide waiting for instruction. He looked up. At the throne. At the throne room. At the impossible, ancient, beautiful space that was simultaneously the most alien thing he'd ever experienced and, in some deep-coded way he couldn't fully articulate, felt like something he recognized. Like something he'd been walking toward his entire life without knowing the destination. What happens now? He asked. Now, Malakar said, and there was something in the ancient voice that was unambiguously fond. You learn. We have time. Considerably more than a human lifetime's worth, now. We will not rush. Izuku looked at his hands. The shadow pulled and moved between his fingers, responsive to thought, to intention, to the exact quality of focused understanding that had been filling notebooks for 15 years and finally, had something to fill besides pages. He thought, analysis of shadow manipulation. Application, compression, expansion, directional control, weight distribution. The shadow responded. Immediately. Eagerly. Like a subject meeting a student who finally speaks its language. Malakar's amusement, warm and vast, resonated gently at the back of his mind. Yes. Exactly like that. You were always going to be exceptional at this. Here is what you need to know about the time that followed. 3 weeks passed in the veil, 3 years, in the subjective experience of learning things that take years to learn. Time in the space between worlds operates on its own logic, answerable to nothing so provincial as human calendars. Izuku experienced this as, and this is the only way to describe it accurately, a compression of becoming. Every hour in the veil contained days' worth of understanding. Every day contained months, not because the learning was rushed, but because in this place, without the constant expenditure of energy required to survive the gauntlet of his ordinary life, his mind could work at its actual capacity for the first time. His actual capacity, which was, it turned out, extraordinary. He learned shadow the way he had learned everything, not by rote but by understanding, not by drilling exercises but by mapping the mechanics, the underlying principles, the physics of a force that operated outside human physics, but was no less rigorous for it. Malakar taught by asking questions, by posing problems and stepping back and watching the remarkable spectacle of Izuku Midoriya's mind attacking them from 17 angles simultaneously and finding the elegant solution every time. You should have been taught this way from the beginning, Malakar said one day, or 1 week, or 1 month. The time had long since become a continuous thing. You were never slow. You were always surrounded by teachers too incurious to teach you properly. It's fine, Izuku said automatically. Stop saying that. He stopped saying that. He learned the demon lord's presence. The aura of dominion, the weight of authority that living beings felt in proximity to primordial power. Learned to calibrate it. Learned the difference between suppressed, undetectable, invisible, a human boy in a school uniform, passive, the slight gravitational pull that made rooms orient toward him, active, the full weight of 10,000 years of sovereignty focused like a lens, the thing that made Noma pause and senators sweat and heroes reconsider their threat assessments. Learned that the presence, at full deployment, was not aggression, it was simply truth. The raw factual statement of what he was, delivered directly to the nervous system of anyone in range. Most people, it turned out, found truth uncomfortable. Izuku found this mildly ironic. He learned the demon's sight. The ability to perceive the soul truth of living beings, to see past the surface to the shape of a person's internal life. Not to read thoughts. More like reading weather, the quality of someone's inner climate. Whether storms were coming. Whether something was broken that shouldn't be. He learned, with this sight, to look back at his own memories, and understood, with a clarity he hadn't been capable of before, what those memories actually contained. He saw his mother with the demon's sight, not the worried woman performing cheerfulness over breakfast, but the extraordinary love beneath it, fierce and enormous, and so present it was almost visible even in memory. He saw his teachers as they actually were, not the authorities he deferred to, but fallible, incurious people operating within a system that punished them for looking too hard at inconvenient cases. He saw Bakugo, and this was complicated, and he sat with it for a long time, He saw Bakugo as the thing he'd always half known and never let himself fully examine, a boy so catastrophically validated by external systems, so addicted to the certainty of his own superiority, that the existence of someone he decided was beneath him, and yet clearly wasn't, had become genuinely destabilizing. The cruelty wasn't confidence. The cruelty was fear of the question that Izuku's existence kept asking. What if you're not the best? What if someone with nothing still sees more than you? He understood this. He did not forgive it automatically. Understanding and forgiveness were different currencies, and he had learned in the Veil to stop spending them interchangeably. But he understood. 3 weeks in the human world. 3 years of becoming. On the last day, or the day that felt like last, the day Malakar said, "I think you're ready," or as close to it as the first time ever allows, Izuku stood in the throne room and looked at himself in the surface of the between stone and shadow floor. He looked the same. That was the first thing. He had been braced, privately, in the way you brace for something you don't want to admit you're bracing for some dramatic physical transformation. Wings, fangs, something irrevocable. But the face looking back at him from the floor's dark mirror was still his. Messy green hair. Freckles. The ink stain on his left index finger that never fully washed off. The eyes were, he looked closer, the eyes were different. Not dramatically, not noticeably unless someone knew what they were looking for. A faint luminescence in the green, a depth behind them that suggested they were seeing more than standard human visual range offered. He looked exactly like Izuku Midoriya. He just looked like all of him, now. The parts that had been hidden. The parts that had been ground down. All of it, present and visible, if you knew how to see it. "You look like yourself," Malakar said quietly. "Which is, I should tell you, considerably more impressive than anything else you could look like." "My eyes," Izuku said, "only when the presence is fully suppressed. When you relax the suppression, even slightly, they'll show what you are. Gold. Slitted. The sight made visible." A pause. "Practice keeping it suppressed. You'll want to choose your moments." Izuku practiced. Once, twice. Felt the shift. Like closing a door, like pulling a shade. Found the mechanism. Filed it. "Am I ready to go back?" "No one is ever ready," Malakar said. "That is not a condition available to the living. You are, however, capable. Which is considerably more useful." Izuku almost smiled. "Is there a difference between your encouragement and regular pessimism, or profound difference?" "Regular pessimism has no investment in your success. My observations are pessimistic with context, realistic with very high personal stakes. A beat. Which I suppose is the same thing. Go home, Izuku." Izuku looked at the throne room one more time. At the columns with their moving carvings. At the phosphorescent light with its deep-sea quality. At the throne that had accumulated itself from centuries of darkness with no particular agenda. "Will I come back here?" "You carry it with you now. Where you are, the veil is." He thought about that for a moment, then he squared his shoulders. Pressed his blazer flat with his palms. The casual, familiar gesture of a boy getting ready to face a school day, performed in an ancient throne room in the space between worlds by a being who was no longer entirely human and not entirely anything else, and was, somehow, more himself than he had ever been. "Okay," he said, and the veil opened. He arrived back in his body on a Tuesday morning in October with the particular gasping quality of someone surfacing from deep water. The school. The hallway. Fluorescent lights and the smell of chalk and cleaning solution, and 30-something teenagers who hadn't noticed that the quirkless nobody in the back left corner had, during the infinitesimal pause between one moment and the next, become something that didn't have a name yet. He sat at his desk. He breathed. He could feel the shadows. Every shadow in the room, the long dark behind the filing cabinet, the dimness under desks, the sharp slice of shadow from the window frame, all of it present to him like a peripheral sense he hadn't had before, like the way you hear a sound and know which direction it came from without consciously calculating it. The shadows waited. Patient. He pressed them down. Suppressed. School uniform and green hair and ink-stained fingers and a face the room had decided was unremarkable years ago, and saw no reason to revise. "Good," Malakar said from the deep place. "Invisible is useful. For now." Izuku opened a new notebook, 38, and wrote the date. Then, underneath it, in handwriting that was steady and deliberate and looked like always but wasn't, Day 1. He walked home alone, the way he always had. The October afternoon light was the same color it always was. The city went about its business. A hero response signal in the distance. The billboard with All Might's grin, enormous and golden, Go Beyond, plus Ultra. He stopped under the billboard for the first time in years, looked up at it, thought about the version of himself who had looked at this face with desperate, grieving worship, who had wanted so badly to be chosen by something like this, and had been passed over and passed over and passed over. You don't need his dream, Malakar said gently. You are allowed your own. I know, Izuku said quietly, to the billboard and the afternoon and the version of himself who no longer existed in quite the same configuration. I know that now. He kept walking. In the shadows around his feet, subtle, invisible unless you knew what you were looking at, which no one in this city yet did, something moved. Gently. Waiting. In the deep place behind his heartbeat, something ancient settled in with the patient familiarity of something that has finally, after a very long time, come home. And Izuku Midoriya walked into the future with eyes that saw more than they showed, and a mind that had always been extraordinary operating for the first time with the power to match, and something burning in him that was no longer just surviving, it was deciding. That night, in his room, his mother knocked. Izuku? Dinner's ready. Be right there, Mom. A pause. The specific quality of a mother listening for something she can't name. You seem different today. He looked at the wall of hero merchandise. The posters. The figures. The 37 notebooks stacked under his desk and the 38th, barely started, beside his lamp. Do I? He said. Lighter, she said, through the door. Her voice held a careful wonder. You seem lighter somehow. Like something you were carrying put itself down. He was quiet for a moment. Yeah, he said softly. I think it did. He heard her smile. Couldn't see it through the door. But he had the demon's sight now, and with it came something he hadn't expected, an expanded capacity for the emotional textures of the people around him. He felt her relief like sunshine through glass. Warm. Real. That love, fierce and enormous, that he'd seen in the memory. Good, she said. Come eat. He looked at himself in the dark window. His reflection, overlaid on the city lights. The face that was his face, with those eyes that were his eyes, containing something that had no precedent. He thought, UA entrance exams are in 6 months. He thought, I have a lot of work to do. He thought, with a clarity and a calm that felt like the first real solid ground he'd stood on in 15 years. I am ready to begin. Malakar, who had been quiet, said only yes. And somewhere in the deep place where an ancient sovereignty had found its rightful anchor, something vast and patient and extraordinary finally, completely, settled. The boy who was told he couldn't was gone. What walked out of the veil in his place wore his face, and his freckles and his ink-stained hands. But it was no longer the boy who apologized for existing. The crown was invisible. For now, 6 months. That's all it took. 6 months between the boy who stood at a railing with nothing left, and the young man who walks through UA's entrance gates on a cold April morning with everything he needs already inside him. 6 months of early mornings and late nights and 38 notebooks becoming 40, then 45, then 52. 6 months of shadow practice in his bedroom with the lights off and Malakar's voice a quiet current beneath his thoughts, correcting, refining, pushing. 6 months of his mother watching him across the breakfast table with that careful, wondering expression she'd worn since October. You seem lighter. And not asking questions he wasn't ready to answer. 6 months. Pay attention to what walks through those gates. Because it is not what walked out of them. UA's entrance examination site was chaos made beautiful. 10,000 applicants. That was the number Izuku had researched. The number who registered, who dreamed hard enough and quirked sufficiently and checked enough bureaucratic boxes to earn the right to attempt this particular gauntlet. 10,000 young people with abilities ranging from mundane to extraordinary, all funneled through the same process, all about to discover that wanting something desperately was a completely different condition from being ready for it. Izuku understood this distinction intimately. He had spent 6 months making himself ready. He stood at the registration desk with his paperwork in hand, every form filled with the meticulous, comprehensive precision of someone who has been taking detailed notes since age 4. And handed it across to the proctor with a pleasant, neutral expression. The proctor glanced at the forms. Glanced at Izuku. Glanced at the quirk registration field. Unregistered. Sir, there seems to be an issue with your... There's no issue, Izuku said quietly. Still pleasant. Still neutral. The field is accurate. A beat. Unregistered quirks are permitted to participate in the practical examination, Izuku continued, because he had read every version of the UA examination bylaws published in the last 12 years and could cite them from memory, provided the applicant signs the supplemental liability waiver acknowledging the Commission's right to request registration documentation upon admission. Which I've already signed. Page 4. The proctor checked page 4, looked up, looked at Izuku with the expression of someone who has encountered an unexpected variable and isn't sure where to put it. Right, he said, after a moment. You're in block 7. Good luck. You won't need it, Malakar murmured from the deep place. I know, Izuku murmured back, too quietly for the proctor to catch. But it's polite to accept. Block 7 assembled in a staging area the size of an aircraft hangar. 300 applicants. Roughly. Izuku stood near the back and did what he had been doing since October with a precision and depth that his classmates would have found, had they known, deeply unsettling. He watched. Not the way people watch when they're nervous and looking for threats. Not the competitive, measuring skin of someone cataloging rivals. He watched the way the demon's sight had taught him to watch, attending to the whole picture simultaneously. The surface and the depth, the quirk manifestation and the soul truth operating beneath it. What he saw was this: extraordinary potential, poorly directed. Brilliance tangled in anxiety. Power without understanding of its own mechanics. 300 young people who had been told their quirks were their value. Who had been so focused on what they could do that most of them hadn't spent adequate time on the far more interesting question of why and how and what else. He recognized the trap. He'd watched them fall into it his whole life. The quirk gifted, so validated for having power that they'd rarely been pushed to think carefully about it. He had spent 15 years with nothing to do but think. He spotted Momo Yaoyorozu across the staging area. He almost missed her. That was the thing. She wasn't performing. While other applicants flexed and demonstrated and established territories the way people do when they're uncertain of their standing, she stood slightly apart, reading, actually reading, a slim technical volume that she held with the careful ease of someone for whom books were oxygen. Her quirk, lipid to matter creation, he'd researched every publicly documented quirk with UA examination history, was extraordinary in its intellectual demands. Creating anything required understanding its molecular structure completely. She was, by any measure, one of the most cognitively advanced applicants in the room. She was also, the demon's sight told him quietly, operating under a cloud of doubt so dense it was almost visible. Interesting, he thought. She thinks the intelligence isn't really hers, Malakar observed. That the quirk does the understanding and she merely channels it. She's wrong. Yes. She is. He didn't approach her. Not yet. He filed the observation in the place where he kept the things that mattered, beneath the immediate architecture of the day's requirements. The examination proctor, Present Mike, UA's voice hero, whose enthusiasm for his own announcements was matched only by his genuine gift for structured chaos, stepped to the front of the staging area with a microphone that he clearly didn't need but used anyway, and began to explain the rules of the practical examination. Izuku already knew the rules. He'd known them for 6 years. He used the explanation time to decide carefully, precisely, exactly how much of himself to show today. This was the calculation. Not can I pass. That question had been settled within the first week of his time in the Vale. The question was how. How to demonstrate sufficient capability to earn admission without revealing the full scope of what he was. Not yet, not here. Not in front of 10,000 applicants and the Hero Commission's evaluation cameras. He needed to be remarkable. He needed to be undeniable. He needed to do it in a way that invited questions without answering them fully. He needed, in short, to be Deku. The name Bakugo had given him as a brand and a diminishment. The name he had decided, somewhere in the phosphorescent light of the veil, to keep. Not because he'd forgiven it, because reclamation was its own kind of power, and he had a particular affection for proving people wrong at scale. Ready? Malakar asked. Izuku put his hands in his pockets. Let's go, he said. The examination course was a fabricated urban environment, a half-kilometer stretch of mock city blocks, detailed enough to be convincing, populated by 3 types of robotic villain targets worth 1, 2, and 3 points respectively. Standard. Documented. Analyzed in his notebooks approximately 11 times from different strategic angles. He knew every camera position. He knew the structural weak points of each robot type, derived from 6 years of watching examination footage and cross-referencing with robotics engineering papers available through the UA Public Research portal. He knew that the 0-point robot, the enormous, building-sized mechanical catastrophe that the examination guide warned applicants to flee rather than engage, had exactly 4 structural vulnerabilities if you knew where to look. He knew everything. The horn sounded. 300 applicants exploded into motion. A chaos of quirks firing, of explosions and ice sheets and sonic blasts, and 17 different variations of enhanced physical ability. The air turned immediately into a sensory cacophony, full of the crackling, booming, spectacular noise of young people with extraordinary abilities competing desperately for points. Izuku walked, not slowly, purposefully, deliberately. He moved through the mock city streets with the unhurried confidence of someone who has decided the situation is entirely under control, which it was, because he had spent 3 years, subjective, veil-time years, preparing for exactly this kind of environment. The first robot came around the corner. 2-pointer. 8 feet of articulated metal with a targeting sensor array and a collision-based attack pattern. It oriented on him, sensor lights cycling to red, and swung. Izuku sidestepped. Just that. A single, economical step, exactly far enough, no further. The robot's arm passed through the air where he'd been with a sound like a freight train. He watched its recovery arc, calculated the half-second window in its reset cycle, and placed his hand flat against its chassis. Shadow moved through the metal, not dramatically. No visual spectacle, no pillar of darkness rising from the earth. Just a careful, surgical threading of shadow through the robot's internal architecture, finding the power coupling between its primary motor drive and its targeting array, and separating them. Cleanly, precisely. Like removing a single thread from a weaving without disturbing anything adjacent. The robot stopped. Every light went dark. It stood there, inert, like a very large and expensive statue. 2 points. Izuku kept walking. Here is the thing you need to understand about the next 11 minutes. It was not loud. That was the part the examination staff watching the camera feeds found most difficult to process, most difficult to articulate in their subsequent reports and post-examination discussions and the 3 separate emergency meetings that would be called at various levels of UA administration in the following week. The other high-performing applicants were spectacular. Explosions, ice formations that stopped whole corridors, sonic quirks that shook the camera housings. The visual vocabulary of heroism, deployed enthusiastically and with genuine skill. This one, Block 7, Applicant 3011, name Midoriya Izuku, quirk status unregistered, was just efficient. He moved through the course like a thought moving through a mind that knew exactly where it was going. He didn't run. He didn't shout or announce himself or perform for the cameras. He navigated the mock city streets with a spatial awareness that seemed to extend beyond his visual range, which it did, because the shadows told him everything. The shadows were everywhere and they were his, and through them he felt the course the way a pianist feels a keyboard. Every robot. Every other applicant's position. Every structural configuration of every block and alley and intersection. He was never where the robots expected him to be. He dismantled them. 1-pointers folded without contact, shadow threading through their systems from 15 feet away, targeted and invisible and absolutely precise. 2-pointers he engaged with a minimum of physical interaction, always one step ahead of their attack patterns, always finding the exact point of least resistance. 3-pointers required more attention, more precision, a slightly more creative application of shadow mechanics. He found himself enjoying these, in the focused, absorptive way he'd always enjoyed a genuinely interesting problem. By the 8-minute mark, he had 63 points. The course average, documented across previous years, was 41. He stopped in the middle of an intersection and looked around at the remaining robots still active in his sector. Looked at the other applicants visible from his position. 2 of them, both struggling with the three-pointer that had cornered them against the wall. He looked at the three-pointer, looked at the two applicants. A boy with a hardening quirk who'd overextended and couldn't retract. A girl with a wind generation ability who'd exhausted herself fighting uphill. Both of them still trying. Both of them about to get hit. He was across the intersection before the decision had fully formed. Shadow swept from the ground in a curved arc, not a wave, not a wall, shaped like a hand, almost like a very large, very careful hand interposing itself between the robot's swinging arm and the two applicants' position. The robot's arm connected with the shadow and stopped, the impact absorbed and redirected, the force distributed and neutralized in the time it took the two applicants to process that they weren't dead. Izuku stepped through the shadow he just used as a shield, placed both hands on the robot's chassis, and unraveled it from the inside in approximately 4 seconds. Three-pointer. Gone. He looked at the two applicants. The hardening boy was staring at him with his mouth open. The wind generation girl had pressed herself against the wall and was breathing hard. "You okay?" Izuku asked. "What?" the boy started. "What was that?" "Shadow manipulation," Izuku said, which was technically true and entirely insufficient. "Are either of you injured?" "No, but good." He checked his internal map, Malakar's presence providing a peripheral awareness of the course's status that functioned like a GPS made of darkness. "There's a cluster of one-pointers in the next block. Northeast. If you go now you can get there before the other group from Sector 6 does." "A beat. Thanks," the girl said, still wide-eyed. He nodded and moved on. It was the 0-point robot that changed everything. He heard it before he saw it, felt it, actually, through the shadows, a displacement of air and ground tremor so significant that every shadow in a 3-block radius shivered with it. He turned to look and found himself regarding what the examination guide cheerfully described as a villain-class threat simulation. 4 stories. Easily. Maybe 5. Articulated metal and visible hydraulics and a targeting array the size of a car, scanning the course with the methodical patience of a machine that had been built to be unopposable and knew it. Around it, applicants fled in every direction, the sensible response, the correct response, the response the examination was designed to reward with rescue points for helping others escape. Izuku stood still. The 0-point robot's targeting array swept across him. Stopped. Cycled to red. 4 structural vulnerabilities, he reviewed, with the calm of someone consulting notes they'd memorized 6 years ago. Left knee joint. Primary hydraulic coupling exposed at 30 degrees of extension. Right shoulder. Armor plate gap during lateral rotation. Cervical junction. 3-inch window accessible during forward pitch. And the main power relay. Dorsal, centered, accessible only if you can get above it. "Can you get above it?" Malakar asked. "I can get above it." The robot swung. The arm that came at him was the size of a highway overpass, moving fast, and every applicant still in visual range stopped running to stare at the quirkless-looking boy in the UA examination zone who was absolutely, inexplicably not, moving. He moved. Up. Shadow erupted from the ground beneath his feet and launched him. Not the crude, explosive upward force of a jet thruster, but something more sophisticated. A column of compressed darkness that extended and shaped itself to his intent, carrying him vertically with the precision of something that understood exactly where he needed to be and the exact force required to put him there. He went past the robot's swinging arm, past its shoulder array, past its head, above it, and for one moment, one very still, very quiet moment, while 30 applicants and approximately 8 examination cameras watched from various positions around the mock city blocks, Izuku Midoriya hung in the air above a 4-story examination robot with shadow pulled in both hands like gathered water, and looked down at exactly the structural point he'd been planning to reach for 6 years. He pressed downward, not with force, with precision. Shadow threading through the armor plate, finding the main power relay, threading through it with surgical exactness, separating the primary from the secondary from the tertiary, and then, with the careful finality of someone closing a door rather than breaking down a wall, disconnecting them. The 0-point robot went dark. All of it. Every targeting array, every hydraulic system, every joint and limb and sensor. The lights died. The sound died. The massive mechanical body wavered. 4 stories of momentum and mass suddenly without direction, and began, very slowly, to fall. He was already descending. Shadow lowering him to the ground with the same precision that had raised him, setting him down in the middle of the street with a gentleness that left no dust cloud, no impact crater, none of the collateral damage that brute force would have required. The robot hit the ground with a sound like the world ending. Then silence. 30 applicants stood in the rubble of a mock city block and looked at one applicant who was brushing a non-existent speck from his school uniform with an expression of mild, thoughtful concentration. 69 points, Malakar said. Plus whatever rescue points the proctors assigned for the 2 applicants you assisted earlier. Well above threshold. Yes, Izuku said quietly. You could have been less obvious. I know. You chose not to be. He looked at the fallen robot. At the 30 applicants. At the 8 camera positions he'd identified and tracked throughout the examination, 2 of which had pivoted to follow him during the 0-point sequence, and had not looked away since. I chose not to be, he confirmed. Good, Malakar said, and there was something in the ancient voice that was unambiguously, warmly proud. Let them see. Let them begin to wonder. The wondering is useful. The examination horn sounded. It was over. The scoreboards posted in under an hour. Izuku stood at the back of the crowd of applicants gathered around the display screens and looked at his number. First place. Written at the top of the Block 7 results with a clarity that left no room for misinterpretation. And felt something move through him that was neither surprise nor satisfaction but something more complicated and more real. It felt like arrival. Around him, voices. Who's that? First place? I didn't even see that shadow thing. Did anyone else see the shadow thing? With the 0 point, he dropped it in like 4 seconds. I've never seen a shadow type do anything remotely like that. He wasn't listening. Not to the specific words. But through the demon's sight, the emotional landscape of the crowd was vivid and varied. Excitement, confusion, competitive anxiety, genuine awe. And from a small cluster of applicants near the front who had been in his sector, something that registered as gratitude, warm and slightly bewildered. He was looking at one face in particular. Momo Yayorosa stood to his left, 3 people over, holding her examination results printout with the particular stillness of someone processing something they hadn't expected. Her score was second in Block 7, high enough to make most people's best day, and she was looking at it with an expression that sat somewhere between satisfaction and its own kind of doubt. The doubt he'd seen in the staging area. The is it really mine doubt, persistent and unfair and entirely, characteristically wrong, as if she felt his attention, which, through the demon sight's passive ambient awareness, she might have, in some way she couldn't articulate. She looked up, met his eyes. He held the look for exactly 1 second, not long enough to be remarkable. Long enough, he judged, to communicate something that couldn't be communicated in words in a crowd of 300 applicants, something that bypassed the surface and arrived at the depth. I see you. The real version of you. Not the doubt. The thing underneath it. She looked away first, but her expression had changed. Something in the set of her shoulders. Something in the way she folded the results printout with slightly more decisiveness than before. Something shifted, infinitesimally, toward believing. Good, he thought, not with satisfaction. With something more fundamental, with intention. The call came the next morning. UA's admissions notification system. Documented, standard, the automated letter and the simultaneous verbal message delivered by the applicant's highest-ranked faculty evaluator. He'd known the process for years. Had watched documentation of it with the specific, wrenching longing of someone watching a door they're not allowed through. He sat at his desk. Notebook 52 open in front of him. Pen in hand. His mother was in the kitchen, not performing cheerfulness today, just being quietly present in the particular way she'd learned over the past 6 months when something important was happening, and she didn't yet know what. The message played. It was not the automated version. Midoriya Izuku. The voice was flat. Entirely without inflection. Completely dry. And somehow, through that very dryness, more serious than any amount of dramatic announcement would have managed. My name is Aizawa Shoyuta. I am the homeroom teacher for UA's Hero course, Class 1A. Your practical examination results placed first overall across all examination blocks, not merely Block 7. You are admitted. A pause. However, Your quirk registration is listed as unregistered. This will require a conversation. Report to classroom 1A at 8 a.m. on the first day of term. Early, before the other students arrive. Another pause, shorter. Don't be late. I hate repeating myself. The message ended. Izuku sat with it for a moment. First overall across all blocks, Malakar said. Not crowing. Just noting. I heard. Not first in your block. First. Across every applicant. Every examination site. I heard, Malakar. A pause. I'm allowed a moment. Despite everything. Despite the weight of the morning, the significance of the message, the prospect of walking into UA in 2 weeks as something that no one in that building had ever encountered before, Izuku smiled. Small. Real. Yeah, he said softly. You're allowed a moment. He heard his mother's footsteps pause outside his door. The quality of her listening, that particular maternal sonar, attuned to every frequency of his breathing and silence. He stood. Walked to the door. Opened it. She was standing in the hallway with a dish towel in her hands and her eyes already bright. Well? She said. He held up the results. And Izuku Midoriya, who had knelt on a doctor's office floor when he was 4 years old and said, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry, looked at her son's first-place results for the UA Hero Course examination, and made a sound that wasn't quite words and wasn't quite a name, just him, just the pure sound of relief so enormous it had to leak out somehow. He let her hug him. He hugged back. And in the deep place behind his heartbeat, an ancient primordial sovereignty had the fundamental decency to stay quiet. 2 weeks. He used them well. Shadow control refined to the point where he could thread tendrils through a moving target at 40 meters with 3mm precision. Presence calibration practiced in the mirror, suppressed, passive, active, back to suppressed, until the transitions were instant and effortless. Demon sight employed in careful, low-key passes through populated areas, the emotional landscape of crowds becoming readable and navigable, filed and analyzed. He read everything publicly available about Class 1A's incoming cohort. He had opinions. On the last evening before term started, he sat at his desk with Notebook 52 and wrote, in the calm, deliberate handwriting that was his own and always had been, the one thing he hadn't let himself write until he was certain. I am going to UA. I am going to be the thing the hero system doesn't have a category for yet. I am going to help people, genuinely, fundamentally help them, not because a licensing board approved my quirk registration, but because that is what I am for. He paused. Malakar, he wrote, which was something he did sometimes, treating the notebook like a correspondence the ancient being could read over his shoulder. Which perhaps he could. Was it always going to be this? Was I always going to end up here? From the deep place, quiet and certain, I don't know. Fate is a story that only makes sense in retrospect. What I know is that you were always capable of this. The path is yours. It always was. Izuku looked at the answer for a long moment, closed the notebook, put on his school uniform, went to bed, did not sleep for approximately 2 hours, because he was human, and tomorrow was the first day, and some things don't bow to 10,000 years of primordial wisdom. Eventually, sleep arrived. He dreamed of the veil, phosphorescent light and between stone and shadow, and a throne that had accumulated itself from centuries of darkness, and a voice like deep water saying, over and over, patient and warm and certain, you were always going to be remarkable. You just needed the road to get there. Now, show them. 8 a.m. 7:53, actually, because Izuku had read Aizawa's publicly documented evaluations and had categorized him as a person whose relationship with punctuality was personal and whose definition of on time trended early. Classroom 1A was empty except for one man sitting on the teacher's desk, not at it, on it, in dark clothing that seemed less chosen and more inhabited, with the particular quality of someone who has not slept in a way that suggested this was by preference rather than circumstance. He had a yellow sleeping bag rolled beside him, and the expression of someone who has seen through approximately everything and found the experience neither surprising nor particularly interesting. Eraserhead. Aizawa Shoyuta, the hero whose quirk could erase other quirks, whose documented combat record was built on tactical intelligence and physical conditioning, and the application of absolutely ruthless pragmatism to every situation he encountered, whose graduation record at UA was unmatched in the past decade, who was widely considered, among the staff, to be simultaneously the most demanding and the most effective homeroom teacher in the institution. He looked at Izuku. Izuku looked at him. "Close the door," Aizawa said. Izuku closed the door. "Sit down." He sat. Aizawa studied him for what might have been 10 seconds or might have been considerably longer. The black eyes moved across Izuku with the quality of examination that was specific to a man who had spent his career identifying threats and finding the hidden mechanisms of capabilities. Not judging, exactly, but assessing. Looking for the real thing beneath the surface. "Your quirk isn't registered," he said. "No. Why? It manifested recently." "I haven't had the opportunity to register it." Aizawa's expression didn't change. Not by any observable measure. And yet something in the air of the classroom shifted, the infinitesimal pressure of a very sharp mind deciding that the answer it had been given was technically accurate and fundamentally insufficient. "It manifested recently," he repeated, in the tone of someone reading a sentence back to confirm they've heard it correctly. "Yes. And in the 6 months between its manifestation and today's date, you used it to place first overall in UA's entrance examination, across every block and every site." "Yes." A pause. "What is it?" And here was the calculation Izuku had run 17 times in the preceding 2 weeks. How much? What framing? Which truth, from the many available truths, to offer to a man whose quirk could theoretically erase his, and who needed to believe, on this first day, that what he was dealing with was unusual but legible, not incomprehensible. Not something that required escalation before the school year had begun. "Shadow manipulation," he said. "Force, precision, range. I can extend it, thread it, use it for mobility and combat application. At full deployment," he paused, chose the phrasing with care, "it's significantly more powerful than the practical exam suggested." Aizawa's eyes narrowed. "Just slightly. Significantly?" "Yes." "How significantly?" Izuku met the black eyes steadily. "Significantly enough that I was being conservative." The classroom was very quiet. Aizawa looked at him for a long moment. Then, and Izuku had not expected this, had not catalogued this as a possible outcome in any of his 17 simulations, something moved at the corner of Aizawa's mouth. Not a smile, exactly, not something so warm or conventional. More like the expression of a man who has been doing this job for many years and has encountered genuine surprise so rarely that he's decided, in this instance, to acknowledge it. "Your quirk isn't registered," Aizawa said again. Same words. Entirely different weight. "No," Izuku agreed. Same answer. Same new weight. A pause. "Get it registered before the end of the first week. Use the support department's documentation process. They're equipped for unusual manifestations." He stood. Picked up the sleeping bag. Tucked it under his arm with the practiced ease of a man whose sleeping bag had been everywhere he'd been and was going everywhere he was going. "The other students arrive in 20 minutes. There are things in this school that will try to evaluate you, measure you, put you in a box. Some of them are students. Some of them are staff." He paused at the classroom door. "I don't put people in boxes." He left the door open. Izuku sat in the empty classroom in the morning light and processed the conversation with the systematic efficiency of a brain that never really stops. "He suspects," Malakar said. "Of course he does. He doesn't know what he suspects. That's fine." Izuku looked at the door. At the empty desks arranged in their rows, waiting for the cohort that would fill them in, minutes now. Let him wonder. Wondering is useful. "You said that yesterday." "It was true yesterday. It's true today." He opened Notebook 52 to a fresh page. Wrote, at the top, Class 1A. First observations. And waited. They came in ones and twos. Watched them arrive. Watched the cohort that would become. Though none of them knew it yet. Though it would take catastrophe and training and a sports festival and the particular alchemy of being thrown repeatedly into the deep end together. Something more than classmates. The first through the door was Ida Tenya, walking with the mechanical precision of someone who had been told what proper posture looked like and had taken extensive notes. Behind him, Uraraka Ochako, round face, bright eyes, the quality of someone for whom enthusiasm was a genuine resting state rather than a performance. Ajiri Tsuyu, quiet and observant, eyes moving across the classroom with an unhurried thoroughness that Izuku clocked immediately as intelligence of a specific and useful kind. Kirishima, loud and open. Kaminari, immediately distracted. Ashido Mina, whose entrance was an event, she came through the door the way some people come through doors, as though the room had been waiting for her specifically. Her eyes found Izuku in approximately 2 seconds, seated alone at his desk in the back left corner, notebook open. The only person in the room who had apparently been there long enough to have formed opinions, and she stared at him with the particular focus of someone who has detected something interesting and has no intention of pretending she hasn't. He met her eyes. She grinned. He looked back at his notebook. Jirakyuka came in quietly, headphones around her neck, the studied nonchalance of someone who has decided that being visibly unbothered is a reasonable armor. She sat 2 desks from Izuku and he felt, not through the demon's sight, not through any supernatural mechanism, just through the perfectly ordinary human experience of being in proximity to someone with interesting internal life, the particular quality of a person who noticed more than she said. He liked her immediately. He noted that fact. Noted it as data. Filed it. And then the door opened again, and the room did something interesting. It shifted, not physically. The desks didn't move, the lighting didn't change, nothing observable altered, but the quality of attention in the room, the background hum of 20 teenagers taking stock of each other, changed. Focused. Because Todoroki Shoto had entered the classroom, and Todoroki Shoto was the kind of person whose presence rearranged a room without effort, and without apparently intending to. He was striking in the specific way that suffering has sometimes shaped a face, something behind the composed expression that was too controlled to be natural, the stillness of someone who has learned that visible emotion is a vulnerability. Half white hair, half red. The burn scar over his left eye, which he made no effort to conceal and no effort to explain. Izuku looked at him with the demon's sight, quietly, briefly, and saw, beneath the composure, beneath the extraordinary physical capability, beneath the dual quirk that the documentation suggested was potentially the most powerful in their year group, a fracture. Old, deep. The kind that had been forming since childhood, and had never been given proper conditions to heal. He noted this too. Don't, Malakar said mildly. Don't what? Don't start planning. Not yet. You just sat down. I'm not planning. I'm observing. You have the face you make when you're planning. Izuku smoothed his expression. Look back at his notebook. Better, Malakar said. The classroom filled. 20 students, arranged by whatever logic had governed their seat selection. Proximity to friends or windows or the door. The unconscious territorial mapping that people performed without knowing they were performing it. Aizawa had not yet returned. The room was full of the specific energy of people who wanted to know what was coming and were performing varying degrees of casual indifference about wanting to know. Izuku was the only one writing. He felt the awareness of him moving through the room. The delayed noticing, one by one, of the student in the back left corner who had apparently been there when they arrived and had not introduced himself to anyone and was currently, with total concentration and apparent complete indifference to social convention, filling a notebook with tiny, careful handwriting. He felt Ashido Mina's gaze return to him 3 separate times. He felt Jayorozu, who had arrived fourth and taken a desk near the front, glance backward with the systematic quality of someone conducting a careful survey and not wanting to be obvious about it. He did not look up. The door opened. Aizawa walked in, sleeping bag under his arm, yellow capture weapon wound around his neck, expression carrying exactly as much enthusiasm as the baseline that experience suggested was its natural resting state, which is to say, none discernible. I'm your homeroom teacher, he said. No introduction beyond that. Sit down if you aren't already. We're starting. 20 students sat. Aizawa's eyes swept the room once, professional and total. They paused, for 1/2 second, on the back left corner. Izuku looked up from his notebook, met those black eyes, and Aizawa said to the room at large, with the flatness of someone reading weather conditions, we have 20 students in this class. All of you placed in the top percentile of this year's entrance examination. A pause. One of you placed first overall. The room did not look at Izuku. The room desperately wanted to look at Izuku. We won't discuss that further today, Aizawa continued, moving to the board. What we will discuss is the fact that being remarkable in an entrance examination is almost entirely uncorrelated with being remarkable as a hero. What matters is what you do with the ability once the pressure is on. He wrote something on the board. So, quirk assessment. Gym 3. Now, a collective breath. And then, because he had been still long enough, because 20 people had been peripherally aware of him since they'd arrived and had run out of patience, Izuku closed his notebook, tucked it into his bag with the practiced ease of someone who had been doing this his entire life, and stood. He was not the first to stand, but he was the one that, without explanation, without announcement, without doing anything that could be pointed to and labeled as the specific cause, made the room quiet as he moved toward the door. Not the uncomfortable quiet of uncertainty. The quiet of people in proximity to something that registers, at some level beneath conscious thought, as significant. He walked toward the door, past Yairo's desk. She was already standing, gathering her things, and as he passed she looked up, a fraction of a second, a glance, and found him already looking at her, not intrusively. Not with the invasive entitlement of someone who assumed every glance was welcome. With the specific quality of someone who had noticed something true about her, and was leaving a door open. If you want to walk through it, it's there. Her chin lifted, almost imperceptibly. Something in her expression, some thin, persistent layer of the doubt, cracked. Just slightly. He kept walking. You're planning, Malakar observed. I'm walking through a door. Semantics. I excel at semantics. He stepped into the hallway of UA's hero course, notebook under his arm. School uniform and green hair and ink-stained fingers and eyes that were suppressed to their ordinary color but were seeing, always seeing, more than standard visual range offered. Around his feet, where the light from the windows fell at angles across the corridor floor, the shadows moved. Barely enough to notice. But if you were watching, if you were really watching, with the quality of attention that most people reserved for things they'd already decided were important, you might have seen it. The shadows in the corners, the dark at the edges of light, the small restless movement of darkness recognizing its sovereign, following him down the corridor.